So hi, folks. Great to be back again. I'm Rajeev, and through this series, we aim to shed some light on the global macro and the investing landscape, which is particularly pertinent given the high amount of uncertainty and volatility we are experiencing currently. Today's topic is actually a juxtaposition of two very interesting trends. The first is green, with most economies, including India, pledging to reach net zero. The conversations around sustainability and the clean energy economy are gaining momentum. The second is demographics. Our speaker for today, Paul Hodges, believes that given our demographic potential in India, we are uniquely positioned to advantage from all of these things that are happening. So today, folks, we have Paul Hodges, a trusted investment advisor and chairman at New Normal Consulting. He produces the PH report, a great name, Paul, a great thing on your name. Great play on chemistry as well, which I think you're a guru and an expert of, given that you hold the chairmanship of NETech Solutions. The question is the macroeconomic economy acidic or basic? I'm sure we'll get to know in the course of this conversation, right? Sorry about the sad joke. He's an expert in analyzing major paradigm shifts in the global economy, and your work on the role of demographics in driving the global economy is widely appreciated. Paul is also a global expert with the World Economic Forum with considerable global experience, having worked in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm going to ask Paul to take center stage for about 20-30 minutes. Folks, don't make any notes because we'll have all the stuff that you're seeing here available after. And after this, we'll move to the Q&A. Please type in your questions in the chat. We'll definitely get to them. Look forward to a productive hour. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Well, thank you, Rajeev, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Very positive. I was just talking to Rajeev about the cricket, which is luckily we can do in India, and we're all looking forward to the World Cup pretty soon. You know the team is going to win, of course, but never mind. We're going to introduce baseball to India, which will be. So, if we could show the slides, please. Exactly as Rajeev said, I want to combine two things here. One is what's happening in the net zero world, and clearly that's important. And clearly, Prime Minister Modi is going down that track today. So we're moving aligned with government policy, which is always helpful. But I want to sort of step out, if you like, and look at the demographics in a moment and say, look, given India's demographic position, you've actually got a different opportunity than perhaps the mainstream might think. Therefore, it might be a misfit opportunity. So next slide, please, Pri. So what I want to do is just to sort of have a quick look at the world as it is today, which looks pretty difficult. And we're coming out of stimulus, and how does that work? Then look at the demographics, and particularly India, and then say, right, okay, we've got all these paradigm shifts going on because of demographics, because of the end of stimulus and so on. Where is the opportunity for Indian investors today? Hopefully we can discuss all of these things. So next slide, please, Pri. As Rajeev said, we are focused on the chemical industry, and we do believe that the chemical industry is the best leading indicator for the global economy. And so we work very closely with ICIS, the main chemicals reporting service. I write their Chemicals and Economy blog. And so if you look at what's happened with stimulus, essentially, if you look back at global overcapacity in the core products, what you see is you always have a degree of overcapacity because you have outages, because you're building for the future, because you never get your timing right, all of these human factors. But then if you look from 2010 onwards, what has happened as a result of stimulus policies, and this is around, just to give you a number, this is around $70 trillion that has gone into the world economy in terms of debt over this period. What has happened is that effectively the central banks have tried to print babies, because outside of India, 9 of the top 10 economies are actually seeing now a decline in the number of people in the critical wealth creator 25 to 54 age group, and they've got a vast increase in the number of perennials, the over 55. And perennials are very nice people like myself, but we don't contribute a lot to the global demand because we already own most of what we need, and we're not having children anymore. And the issue is that this group of people, the perennials, didn't exist 50 or 100 years ago. You died at, if you go back 100 years, you died at about 50. If you died in 1950, you died at around pension age. You died at a lower age, obviously, in India. And so this group of people who are now the main source of population growth in the world, are not contributing much to global demand. And what the arrogant central banks did was say, oh, that doesn't matter. If we just create all this debt, we will get demand. And what they've done is they've contributed to massive overcapacity. So if you look at on the right-hand side there, the picture from ICIS pricing indices, and you just go back to around June or so, summer last year, and what you see is that prices are around 35% lower in Northeast Asia. Globally, they're around 34% lower than they were. So crude and so on haven't gone down that much and so on. This is purely overcapacity and a shortage of demand. And we'll come on to that. So next slide, please, Pri. So what we're doing for those who sort of follow the four horsemen of the apocalypse, part of the Bible, we're looking really. We've got a war, obviously going on in Ukraine, the first war on the mainland of Europe since the Second World War. That's led to an energy crisis. We've had the plague. I don't need to talk any more about that, COVID-19 and the supply chain crisis that came along with it. We are approaching famine. One of the problems we have is that Russia has reduced or cut off entirely, depending on which country you're in, its natural gas supplies. And natural gas, of course, is supplied for ammonia. Ammonia goes into nitrogen fertilizer, and nitrogen fertilizer supplies the food for half of the world's population. You won't miss hearing that nitrogen fertilizer, according to our world in data, is responsible for half of the food in the world. And of course, what Russia is also doing now is it's not only stopped Ukraine's exports of grain, it's also now blowing up the ports. So we are going to get into a very serious food crisis over the winter. And the issue, of course, with fertilizer is that you plant today for next year's season. So you're not planting for, it's not like stock markets where you do something 1 minute and next minute it happens. You go out, you till the fields, you put in your crop, you do the fertilizer, and then next year you get the crop. And so that's why we're still seeing food prices going up, even more than seasonally. They fluctuate, and they're still in the teens, whereas inflation itself is coming down. And then, of course, we've got inflation, and we've got major stock market and housing market risks, which we just overvaluation because of all this debt that's gone into asset prices. So next slide, please, Pri. So really what this is saying is the risks are multiplying and becoming more complex. You've got very high and volatile pricing. You've got interest rates rising. I mean, interest rates are rising while we talk. There was this, oh, no, the Fed has sorted all this out. We're going back to 2%. Well, actually not, because Japan last Friday abandoned, effectively, yield curve control. So Japan's 10-year rates are now on the way back to world levels. Now, what does that mean? That means that all the people who borrowed in yen in order to take advantage of interest rates or whatever in other countries, higher interest rates, are now saying, well, if we're going to be able to get 3 or 4% in Japan, why do we take the risk of investing anywhere else? Why do we, and having to cover the currency and so on, we'll bring that money back. And so, in the last week, last 6 days since that happened, US rates have jumped up above 4%, and we're pretty confident they will go to 5%. I imagine what that's going to do to the economy. So in other words, the Fed is no longer in control here. We're starting to see corporate earnings going down right along, a 7% fall in the S&P 500 so far. It will get worse, and the chemical industry is showing 70 or 80% declines in earnings because we're earlier in the value chain. We tell you always 6 to 9 months ahead of the main market where things are going. And of course, if we look at plastics, very important market in itself, a lot of overcapacity as we discussed, and of course, growing environmental pressure, the UN treaty on plastic waste in the ocean coming along at the moment, being negotiated, and other regional activities, as in the EU, to restrict waste plastic. So next slide, please, Pri. So essentially, what we've got is we no longer have to sort of sit here in the morning when we wake up and think to ourselves, I wonder how Jay Powell slept at the Federal Reserve last night. I wonder if he had a nice breakfast. I wonder if his coffee was the right thing. Is he going to come to the office in a nice shape of mind or not? In other words, we don't have to focus on the Fed anymore. What we have to do is we have to focus on the real issues that are out there: geopolitics, energy markets, demographics, business cycles, and so on. And we have to take a view. Now, it's perfectly possible, some people will do it, very optimistic, that say, yeah, actually, it's all business as usual. And really, things are indeed, no, I'm not really listening to what you're saying, Paul. Actually, things are okay. It's just a temporary blip this last week. It will all go back. So we're in business as usual. Other people say, okay, yes, Paul, I hear what you're saying about inflation going back, and I can see what you mean about food prices and so on. But in the end, we'll come through that. We've been through inflation rises and so on. Other people may say, well, yes, we have got an economic recovery coming through, and I sort of accept that, geopolitics are probably going to be a bit more important than they've been recently. Energy markets, yeah, I can't ignore those. Actually, yeah, I take what you're saying about demographics. So we accept that you've got more permanent risks here. We have to adjust the way we look at the world. And then, of course, we've got this new normal idea, which says because of the mistakes made by the central banks over the last 20 years in pumping out all of this debt, and combine that with the recession, and combine that with net zero and the need to do something about climate change, we can't just continue as we are, then the landscape itself is changing. And we're essentially, if you think about landscapes, landscapes are a bit like climate. Where I think we are is we had a post-World War II landscape, which was the Cold War. Then when the Berlin Wall fell, then we had globalization. And we had sort of major economic growth, and we had the baby boomer boom going on. And now I think we're moving into a third landscape, which is really around sustainability and doing more with less, because that's the key, if you like, not only for the climate, but also for an aging population. So over to the next, Pri. So just flick through that. So just to talk about the population, essentially, if you look at consumption, which is really what we're interested in as investors, what we see is that in all countries of the world, data going back generally sort of at least till 1950, in many cases earlier than that, what we see is that there are three groups in the world. There are we call the under 25s, who have quite a bit of demand but don't really contribute much to the global economy. They're growing up, they're going to college, they're going to technical school, doing apprenticeships or whatever. Then 25 to 54, they're beginning to settle down. They may get married, they move up in their careers, whatever it is, they earn more money, they have kids, or just if they set up home themselves and they have more demand, but they're creating demand and they're creating supply. And then you get to the perennials, and the perennials over 55, they are really they have a low growth, but they're still working, and so there's a bit more supply going on. So if you just look at the data here, in the wealth creator period, 1950, you had 900 million wealth creators in the global economy, and in 2015 you had 3 billion. And you're moving now, still a little bit of growth between 2015 and 2030, up to 3.3 billion. And they're around 40% of the global economy. So you can see that tremendous surge in demand and output. as this historically unique period of what we call the baby boomers swept out across the world. But now look on the right-hand side and the effect of increasing life expectancy. 1950, 10% of the population lived over the age of 55, right? 250 million. 2030, we're looking at 1.8 billion, and they're going to be double that share. They're going to be 22%. So what you see outside of India, and you'll see that's happening in all the continents there, Africa, Asia, Europe, and so on. What you're seeing is outside of India, in the major economies, you don't need stuff anymore because everybody, perennials, have got stuff. What you're looking at now is sustainability and the value of services rather than volume. Next slide, please. So just to demonstrate that point, essentially the difference is that the perennials 55 plus are a replacement economy. And so if you look, I've just taken the States, but I could use any country that you like. What you see is that the demand in the state goes up. In the States goes up from under the age of 25. It's relatively low. You go to school, you've got demand and so on. It jumps up, if you like, to peak at around $75,000. And then after the age of 55, it comes down by about 45%. It's almost half of what it is by the time you get to 75. So what does that mean if you take the US economy and you just look at the split between 2000 and 2021? So over that 21-year period, you've got 24 million more perennial households than 2000, hardly 1 million more wealth creator houses. Critically, the right-hand side, the perennials spend 12,000 less each year than the wealth creators. And of course, that's a slightly favorable picture, because when you move from being 54 to 55, you don't immediately lose 45% of your spending. So it's a gradual process, if you like. And as the population gets older, so that spending goes down. So what we've got here, and we're talking about the major world economies here, the top 10 economies. So the wealth creators dominate consumer spending, and because of this group of perennials, we're now seeing major state change in demand patterns. Next slide, please. Now, let's come to India, because India is a really interesting and important economy, as we all know. So if we look at India today, what we see is you're just about peaking now in terms of the under 25s. Birth rates are coming down. Birth rate recently has come down below the replacement level of 2.1 babies per woman from the first time ever. So it's following the pattern. As you get more economically secure, you have fewer babies. And what you see is, yes, you've still got growth in the wealth creators, the only major economy that's still got growth there, that kind. And yes, you've also got growth in the perennials. But one cautionary word from this new Pew Research Center, the very respected independent US charity, China, to follow China, a lot of people talk about, India can take over from China in global supply chains. Actually, India can't. Because if you look at the number of people in low income, China is actually 20 or 30 years ahead in terms of moving people out of absolute or near poverty into more of a sort of slightly higher. I don't use the word middle income because it's not particularly middle income, but just to put some numbers on it, India at the moment has 2 million people, Pew calculate, who have a daily income of more than $50 a day. China has 23 million. So there's a tenfold increase, and you're looking at 640 million earning relatively low amounts of money, low income, whereas you're looking at 1.2 billion in India. So we've got a different opportunity here, but it is a big opportunity. I don't want to lose track of that. So next slide, please. I want to talk about the Lewis curve. Now, Arthur Lewis was a West Indian who came to the UK during the war, and the UK Foreign Office realized during the war that it wasn't going to be able to hold on to the colonies. I don't need to talk about anyone in India about that. And they were worried about how do you get the industrial revolution that the UK and Western countries have gone through, what's the process by which this happens so that you just don't leave people. And what Lewis said, and he got a Nobel Prize for it, he was a very, very bright guy, was he said that if essentially you start off working in the fields and you're not very efficient and so on, then you become more labor intensive. And so India has really, at that period, you have a benefit because people who were working in the fields who come into the cities and start working there, they start to work longer hours than they were working in the fields, where they were naturally working around harvest and planting season and so on, and weeding and so on. They weren't working full time, whereas when you move to the cities, you do tend to work longer. So you get a free ride for 20 or 30 years. But then you have to move into capital intensive manufacturing. This is the Industrial Revolution and so on. And then you have to move into the services. And this takes time. And you can see the Lewis curve there. So on the right-hand side, you've got Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan in Asia, who've all made it through that. But if you look at where India is today, it hasn't really moved on. Say it's 30 years. I date the start of industrialization to around 1990. You may disagree, but that's what I've used here. And India hasn't really moved up in terms of GDP per capita using the IMF latest data. So there is a problem here which needs to be addressed, and that's really an important second aspect of what we're talking about. So next slide, please, Pri. On to the next one. So keeping an eye on time and wanting to get to questions and so on. I hope I've convinced you is that they've got a lot of changes going on, which are essentially making paradigm shifts in a way that we haven't seen for the last 20 or 30 years. So we've seen a lot of changes in demand patterns. All sorts of industries are seeing major change. People working from home, for example, no longer going to the office. We've got it in the States and in Western Europe, got a major problem in commercial real estate, which we started to see with Silicon Valley Bank going bust spectacularly in March, but we're going to see more because, look at places like San Francisco and so on, they've got vacancy rates now of over 20, 30%, similarly in parts of New York and so on. And clearly that's untenable. So those areas are going to go bust. Advanced manufacturing, Rajeev mentioned, I have the privilege to chair a company called Nitec Solutions, which is introducing continuous manufacturing for the first time to the specialty chemical area and the fine chemicals area. And we've just done a big project with Croda, the world leader in personal care, where we've reduced the time that they take for their one of their main products, their batch reaction time, from 10 hours to 2 minutes. From 10 hours to 2 minutes. And we've also, obviously, at the same time, made an enormous contribution in terms of reducing energy costs, reducing water use, and so on. So there's some really big shifts starting to happen here. I don't need to talk about reshoring supply chains. You know all about that. I don't need to talk in India about renewable energy. Financial markets, we're seeing governments suddenly now moving away from monetary policy to fiscal policy, and they're worried, obviously, about the major asset bubbles that we've got from all these stimulus programs. And clearly, we have also got major moves towards a more circular economy. As I said, the UN treaty, EU regulations on restricting single-use packaging and so on. So some really big shifts taking place in the landscape here. And so next one. So one of the things that's happened is that when we had that great surge of wealth creators, people in the 25 to 54 age group, what we developed was this new middle market, which we'd never really had before. So, we had we've always had Rolls Royces and Bentleys and so on, and we've always had, Tatars and so on, and companies operating at the value end, but suddenly we developed a middle market where you could, you had the same platform, you had the same technology, but you, in the car industry, for example, you put a go faster stripe on it, and you put in better seats and heating or cooling or whatever it was the people wanted, and so you got this new middle market, and that middle market is now disappearing. And so we're going back to, and again, this is a big opportunity for India. We'll come to it in a moment, because you're the specialists in the value market, and so there's some big opportunities coming along here. So next slide, please. And so what we're seeing, of course, is we already, because of net zero, we were seeing a major ramp up in electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and Russia's invasion last year has catalyzed that. Suddenly, the International Energy Agency came out, which has always been a defender of fossil fuels. Whatever happens, they say, oh, we've got to keep investing in fossil fuels. Now they're saying, no, 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 we can't be dependent on Russia and OPEC anymore. They're completely unreliable suppliers. They don't have the world interest at heart. So we have to go to renewables. We have to move away in chemicals from virgin plastic to recycled plastic, and in cars away from gasoline and diesel to electric vehicles. And we're seeing that this is data from the IEA and from Bloomberg. We're going to see very rapidly now the growth. We're going to go from 26 million EVs on the road in the world this last year up to 100 million by 2026. And we're going to see 27% of global sales being EVs. Now, is that relevant for India? Probably not. I mean, we've seen a couple of people trying to do IPOs for an EV or a market. It hasn't really worked. We've seen BYD coming in and saying, oh, look, we'll spend $1 billion. And the government saying, yeah, we're a bit worried about the security risks here. So final slide here. 3. So what we've got here now is you've got a different position in India. And so what we can see is, if you look at the Indian motor vehicle market, what you see is that motorbikes, two-wheelers, are around 75–77% of the market. And there's quite a nice, Mahindra and others have a decent position in exports as well. Yes, the number of cars is rising, but they are too expensive for most people. I mean, we tried, 10, 15 years ago, some of you may remember Tata came out with a nano car priced at $2,000 to try and help people move away from two-wheelers, which are pretty dangerous, to a car, but it just didn't take off because it was too expensive. So sticking to electric vehicles, what we can see now is that they're starting to see a major increase in the move of electric motorbikes. And so this is a really good opportunity, A, because it fits with the concept for India of moving to net zero. That's very important. Secondly, it encourages the growth of renewable energy. So that's very important too. Thirdly, it creates an India-centric supply chain, which India can dominate. There's lots and lots of people who want motorbikes around the world. It's not India. India may have a large number of people on motorbikes, but everybody has motorbikes. So there's a really good opportunity here. And going back to the Lewis curve, this could turbocharge the rather failing, if you like, move to capital-intensive manufacturing and start to move India up the Lewis curve and start to move towards becoming more of a middle-income country. So that's enough from me, Rajeev. I hope I've thrown out a few ideas here that people will find interesting, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
So thank you, Paul. That was really exciting. Really appreciate the the half an hour of context setting and giving us the broad thesis, and love the insights that you had to share. I was a little intrigued and wanted to dive a little deeper into a couple of points that you had. The first one you said was the middle market is disappearing. Let me understand this a little bit. So there's a luxury, there's a middle, and the value. And you're saying basically until 2020, it used to be that there was a bigger and bigger, or at least equal sized middle market. And now that's sort of leaching towards the either side. Right? Is that what is happening, and why is it happening?
Well, if we take the smartphone market as an example, and we go back 10 years when the smartphone market had got off the ground, I take Samsung as being the epitome of the middle market, and it was around a third of the market. So Apple was always up there at sort of 18-20% of the market, top of the range, and so on. And then the rest was value, if you like, and that was Neo, that was Oppo, Lenovo, and companies like that. And the reason for that was that if you have a surge in wealth creators, and we saw what happened in the smartphone market was only what happened in virtually every market in the world, in cars and so on, was that if you've got a surge in the number of people in this area, go from 1 billion to 3 billion and so on, you've got more spending power and people want a little bit more. They want something distinctive. They don't just want, I don't want exactly the same car as you've got, Rajeev, because I want to be slightly different. In the UK, we call it keeping up with the Joneses. And so in every area, there was scope for modest differentiation in your offering. And if you were, if you just had a bonus or you were feeling a bit better, you would tend to, think, oh, I'll treat myself, I deserve this, and so on, to show people that you'd actually moved up. But what we've seen since 2013, this is only over 10 years, is that market share of Samsung has really halved now from 33 down to 17%. And that's because this, the wealth creator group is now reducing relatively in size, and the perennials are growing in size. And the perennials don't have much money. I mean, if you at 55, you're still working, but at some point you retire, you move on to a pension, and so you have less money to spend. So you want something which works, but you don't necessarily want to be showing your friends. I mean, I remember we used to have an Asian conference, and my colleague at the time, John Keeley, used to be with Shell. I remember just for a laugh, Apple had just launched their first iPhone, and he held up his golden glasses case and said, "Here, I have the new Apple iPhone." And the audience went, "Oh, wow! Oh, Mr. Keeley, this is fantastic!" And so on. There was just that excitement, and everybody wanted to have this top of the range, and they couldn't quite afford top of the range. They certainly wanted better than the cheapest one. And now people are quite happy with the cheapest. So that's really where we go. We still have a need for the functionality. And this is happening, I would say, if you look at the 5 main needs of us as people, it's obviously health, it's obviously food, it's obviously water, it's mobility, and it's shelter. And in all of those markets, we're now seeing the middle market disappearing. And yes, is it functionally good enough for me? Yes, please. And of course, there are wealthy people like yourself and all your investors, Rajeev, who are up at the top end. But the rest of us, are tending to trick down and say, yeah, value is enough for us.
Hardly. I would like to be in the position of the UK Prime Minister, but I unfortunately am not at this.
You can say that.
But let me explore this a little bit more. So it seems to me that this is fairly, and I think Mr. Nair is also asking the same question. This seems to be a position that's more led by the perennial increase, which is not actually true in India. Right? Isn't that something? So wouldn't that trend actually be the middle market would actually be increasing or be the same size in India? Wouldn't that be true? I mean, given that we are slightly different from the rest of the world.
I think that's a really interesting question. And that was really one of the reasons why I was trying to single out India. So on the one hand, what I'm saying is, because I say there is a simplistic idea, oh, India can just replace China. And what I'm saying is, no, you can't. Because education levels and everything else, income levels aren't at the right level to do that. You're at the level that China was at 20 or 30 years ago. And so, most of China was incredibly poor, even 20 years ago, earning $5 or less a day. Mm-hmm. But also that those global supply chains supplying the wealth creators, they don't exist anymore because the wealth creators. So what I'm suggesting is that a solution of India using its strengths to supply an Indian market, and exactly, right, you've got a 20, 30-year run here because of the demographics. So what's the best way to do this? To get in at the bottom, if you like, of the market and grow with the market. And as people get more money, and it's a virtuous circle that as you contribute to a greater standard of living and a greater standard of affluence, so people can afford more, so they want more, and you are in prime position. People like Hindustan Lever, for example, learned this a long time ago. You start off by selling a sachet of soap powder to a lady in a village, and as she gets more money, so she buys a box, and then she buys other things from Hindustan Lever. It's that principle I'm talking about.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the next question, really. I think I was quite intrigued to understand the nuances of the replacement economy versus, I guess I would call it the new demand economy, right? And I would say India sort of fits into the new demand because we still have about 40% of the population under 22. And by the argument you've just now laid out, I mean, I think that's the new demand economy. There are going to be a lot more houses, a lot more furniture, a lot more cars, a lot more buses, a lot more roads. Everything is going to be required, right? Versus the replacement demand, which would perhaps be more a UK kind of an environment where, everybody already has these. Only if things die out, do you need to buy the next refrigerator or the next washing machine? What does that actually mean in terms of the market demographics? But it looks like India is moving in a direction away from the rest of the world, and hence cannot supply to the rest of the world. Isn't that true? I mean, that would mean that we actually are going to be diverging from the world, and hence we can't actually integrate with them.
Well, this is a really important question, and actually deserves quite a lot of thought. I think not just in this webinar. What essentially you've got is one of the world's top economies with 1.4 billion people is in a different position from the other 9 top economies. The other major economy, obviously of similar size in terms of demographics, is China, and China now has more deaths than births every year. More deaths than births. So, it's the same as Japan. So, so you are I couldn't emphasize this too much. You're really very different. Now, if you then look around Asia and you look around Latin America, you look around even Europe and so on, does that mean that everybody in the rest of the world is actually middle class, if you like? Not at all. You've got a great opportunity, if you like, if you look at countries like big countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. These are countries which are similar kind of states to India, but smaller. And so, do they need motorbikes, electric motorbikes? Yes, they do. Do they need electric cars? Well, they need some. So, really what I'm suggesting here is when you think about a market, and we haven't had to think about markets for the last 10 or 20 years, it's just been go for it and there you are. Now we have to start thinking and getting a bit cleverer about what we're doing. And so what we're saying is, if I look at the market around Asia and I look at the market in India, I see that it hasn't got a lot of money, but it's got some, and it's moving up the thing. So I say to myself, well, as a businessman, what can I do to support that? What is the government doing? What can I ride on the back of government support and so on? Electric motorbikes looks a pretty good bet from that point of view. What kind of electric motorbike do I want to come up? Do I want a Harley Davidson with heated seats or whatever it is? No, I don't. I want a basic delivery motorbike, the kind that we showed in the picture. And I want to think about being able to sell those outside India, because there's an awful lot of other kids who would quite like an electric motorbike too. And so we get on that first run. Now that's how. So it's really two areas. One is thinking about the demographic. What is the age group of the market, and what are they earning at the moment? And then secondly, having understood what they are earning at the moment and what they can afford, therefore, then I start to say, well, and which, what kind of market is that? And it's a value market. So I don't need to think about putting bells and whistles on it. What I actually want is a motorbike that works and is reasonably safe. If I can do that, I'm winning.
Yeah, interesting. So if I were to understand the impact of green on this, are you saying then that the next generation of wealth is not really going to go into cars? They're going to sort of taper off around the motorbike ecosystem going forward in the future, because green is going to intervene there and say cars are off because that's too much of consumption without the commensurate, sort of with a commensurate burden on the planet, right? So is that where we are going? So it's going to become a bigger and a better bike market, and it's not really migrating to cars. Is that what we're saying? As we go along to the world where in Indonesia and India get richer, you're going to have more and more bikes, but the switch to cars is not going to happen.
I think that, if you look at the progress of India over the last 10 or 15 years, and we've gone through, various stages of great excitement, incredible India and everything else. Actually, sales of cars have risen over 10 years by 50%. There's still only 3 million. 3 million in a country of 1.4 billion is not, I'm not very good at maths, but it doesn't sound a lot to me, really. And China actually, is only 24 million. So, although people talk a lot about China, but I do think what you're asking is an interesting question, because if you assume that in 5 to 10 years you start to develop a better road service, and forgive me, but you start to get the cows off the road and you begin to be able to I know that's a terrible thing to say, but there you go. And so you start to develop, and India's doing a lot, as you said, on new roads and everything else. Where I think you get to is that you actually skip a stage. If we look at the telecoms market again, India, like China, has not gone through the landline stage. Everybody in the West had landlines. Thank you very much, Mr. Bell. And then we went to mobile. But China and India, you've not done that. You've gone straight. What I think you'll do is you'll go from electric motorbikes, because you do need better mobility than you've got at the moment. That's very clear. And you've got to, the green side of it. We know that the air quality in the major cities is appalling at the moment, and some of that is domestic cooking and so on. But quite a bit of it is motorbikes and so on. And the more we can do, therefore,
and the cows.
Yeah. So we can do that. But where I think we get to is in 5-10 years' time, we've probably moved to autonomous vehicles. And there's, sort of about 60 or 70 cities in the world now who are looking at the concept of the 15-minute city, where it says, essentially, you can get to, this is a Colombian professor who came out with this concept a few years ago, and it's really taking off fairly fast. The idea is that you can get to all the main facilities that you need in a city, either by walking or cycling within a 15-minute rate. So you can get to hospitals and health services, you can get to schools, you can get to offices, you can get to shops, you can get to leisure facilities and so on. And what that says then is that you don't need to have an individual car, because a car is incredibly expensive. It's the second most expensive thing outside of a house, and all the evidence shows that a car is only driven 4% of the time. I mean, I know there's lots of traffic jams in India, but even so, it's about an hour a day or so. So it's very expensive for not a lot of basic utility. So if you could move to a world of autonomous vehicles, and China is now this month, in fact, or last month, launched fully commercial autonomous vehicles in a 500k area around Beijing, where the car will come and pick you up and drop you off, and you pay for the load and so on. If you can get that going, then essentially what you can think of is that in Mumbai, in Delhi, and so on, you divide up the city into squares, if you like, sort of smaller areas, and those are your 15-minute bits. And then if you want to move from one to the other, I want to get to the railway station, I want to go and visit Rajeev and so on, or whatever, then you take an autonomous, a robo-taxi. I think that's how it will go.
And I think Europe is already, so I was in Berlin recently, and everywhere you see these scooters, right? You put €1, you just basically do your phone and then you're just zooming off, and you're zooming off at 12, 13 kilometers. It's actually quite dangerous on the pavements, actually.
Yeah.
If you think about similar in Amsterdam, where I had 3 or 4 meetings, and all these chaps land up completely flushed and, perspiring and in full suits, and they've all come in cycles, right? Nobody's taking cars and bikes there anymore. So I think, some of these things are already happening. Great.
I mean, one of my colleagues was over in California last month, and there's literally hundreds of autonomous vehicles around in San Francisco at the moment. And he said it's quite weird, because normally if you step out, you look at the car driver to check that he's seen you, but there is no car driver. So when you talk about changing demand patterns, has he seen me or not?
Absolutely. One last question, really, Paul. This question has to do with, look, I mean, we are talking these amazing things about the future and what's going to happen, and it looks like the global economy hasn't heard, right? It's still Jerome Powell that is dictating all the shots, even though you've said no, don't look at him anymore, not worth it. It's also, global liquidity, and everybody's talking about how liquidity is causing a lot of these things. It's obviously debt and the massive debt overhang that we have across the world, which is sort of causing a lot of angst across the world. You mentioned the real estate, commercial real estate bubble in the Western world, which I think is fueled by debt by definition, and there's a lot of debt that sort of go and get crunched because there's not enough of equity holding that debt up, right? So those kinds of things. So why is the world not listening to all of this stuff, and why is green sort of taking a back seat? At least it seems that way over the last couple of years, at least since the Russian invasion, and since the Germans have gone back to maybe consuming 70% of energy through coal because they got rid of all their nuclear and other things. I mean, when is this going to flip around and come back to the green world again?
Well, I mean, just to pick you up on the German position, actually, Germany is moving forward very fast on renewables. I think you've got to recognise we're at a paradigm shift, and it isn't just 3 steps forward; it's actually 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So I don't agree with Germany closing the nuclear plants. I think that's completely stupid, but that's what they decided to do. I don't agree with the Netherlands closing the Groningen gas field. I think that again is completely stupid. But people do stupid things, or they think I'm stupid, whichever way you want to go. But what you do know is that Germany is moving very fast now to renewables, and there are targets 2030 and so on, 2025, and they're doing it. Now, that's not to say it's easy to do it, because you're still dependent on China for a lot of the raw materials and so on, solar panels, etc., etc. So this is not straightforward, and it doesn't always have political, but it really is. And I wouldn't underestimate the International Energy Agency, which since set up at the time of the first oil crisis in '74, has always up till now said we must have more fossil fuel development. We are dependent. And now they're saying, no, we must plan for having, okay, fossil fuels will still be there 20 or 30 years time. You can't just dismantle everything, but we must plan for having the majority being renewables. So that's there at the moment. Now, the second question, why is the world economy still appearing to look okay? Well, I regard it, if you remember the Roadrunner cartoons that we were all brought up on, and Wile E. Coyote, and I see the world economy in that position of Wile E. Coyote. We've run out now, we've been chasing, and we're now over the precipice, quite a long way over the precipice, and at some point we will look down. And when we look down, we realize, and that's what keeps me up at night. And the flashpoint to this, I had a conversation with a very senior central banker, which shows you how far away we are from understanding this, where I said to her, I said, look, I'm very worried about the potential for an Asian debt crisis. If I look at China, it's got debt to GDP nearly 3 times. If I look at Japan, it's got debt to GDP of 260%. And what you can see is China is 29% dependent on real estate. Prices last year, in July this year, fell 33%. This is not a real estate bubble that has some risks. This is a real estate bubble that is bursting very fast. I mean, it's down 60% from where it was in 2020. So, China's economy is, and I use the word advisedly, is in danger of imploding, because it is 29% and it has this debt. Now, the trigger has always been, to me, Japan, and this absurd idea of yield curve control. We'll keep our interest rates at 0.25%, 0.5%, and that will enable us to, somehow get inflation. So you can't have inflation with, generally speaking, on a sustainable basis with an aging population, for the reasons we've discussed. Now, what happened in December was that the yen started to collapse, and it went very quickly in October. It went down about 17% almost overnight, which for a major currency like Japan's is incredible. And so they had to suddenly increase the interest rate from 0.25% to 0.5%. And now, last Friday, we saw them saying, essentially, actually, we can't control it at all. And it's moved up above 0.5%. There's a target of 1% and so on, but it will go to world levels. Now, what has happened to the world economy since then? Interest rates around the world have raced up. So we're suddenly, everybody, if we'd had this conversation a week ago, you'd have said, but Paul, interest rates are falling. Everybody's saying they're going to be down at 3% soon in the States and so on. Well, actually, they've gone up. They're back over 4%. And, people are now saying, oh, they'll go to 5%. Why? Because what people were doing, they were borrowing in a very cheap economy, very low interest rate, 0.25% or something, in a depreciating currency. Your investors will understand that. And they were investing in Mexico and covering the currency or whatever, and they were making out 5%, 10%, however clever they were doing. Now, all of that money is now that carry trade is now over. And so what we're seeing is a huge sucking sound. So money that was going out of Japan is coming back into Japan. And that, of course, will reduce inflation, which, of course, isn't what the central bank wants, but that's tough, And what it will also do is it pushes up interest rates around the world. Now, as I say, I was talking to a very senior central banker, and I said to her, I'm very worried about an Asian debt crisis, because clearly Japan, 265% debt of GDP, if that happens, it's bust. And she said, oh, but we had an Asian debt crisis in 1997, and it was relatively small, and we coped with it. And then she paused, and then she said, "But of course, they were all much smaller then, weren't they, as economies?" Yes, they were. I haven't seen anything on this. I haven't seen any papers, and that's my real response to you. Nobody has looked at these geopolitical landscape issues for 10 or 20 years. We've only worried about whether Jay Powell or Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen or Greenspan has had a nice morning, and what are they going to do with interest rates? Now we have to get back to the real world, and I think it's going to be a very bumpy ride.
Wow, what a fitting ending to the conversation, Paul. Thank you so much. I just love that ending. I don't feel like gainsaying anything here.
I tried to talk about positive things up till now, Rajeev, but you did ask.
Well, I mean, I think India is obviously in an optimistic space right now. We don't have too much of debt. I mean, at least compared to our neighbors, we don't. We've got a digital ecosystem that's going on, and I think hopefully some of these trends that you're talking about will actually converge to make India more relevant. So looking forward to it. I look forward to also getting you back into India, Paul. We would love for you to come here and do this face to face. So at some point in time, amen to that. And thank you so much for sort of making this. Really appreciate it.
And I think the details are on the slide. If anybody wants to get in touch, final plug, we are a consultancy. If we can help you with any of this planning, we'd love to do it.
Absolutely. We'll put that up in the of course in the social media posts as well. So absolutely, we'll make sure that stuff is available to everybody. Thank you so much. Look forward. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. Great to talk to everyone.
Bye-bye. Cheers.